Alright, this is my report on experiment 5. So the materials we used was non-anti-dust chalk. We had 5 Sharpies, the colors being green, red, blue, purple, and black. We were using alcohol, and we had a stopwatch to time everything. So in my hypothesis, I said that I think the black and purple Sharpies will remain as a single component, and the other 3 will break off into multiple pieces. I think that they're going to break off into at least 3 different kinds of pieces, and I think that the darker colors will contain the same color and components. So the constants were the type of chalk and how long it was, and the type of solvent that we used, with the variables being the colors of the Sharpie, the number of components separated, and how far the components traveled along the chalk. So for my data for my green Sharpie, obviously the color was green, and this separated into 2 components. First it was yellow, and then it's moved into also having blue. These can also be found in blue and yellow Sharpies. And the observations that I made for this particular Sharpie was that the yellow dye moved higher up on the chalk, as the blue one stayed lower, and the yellow dye also moved faster because it was being more carried by the alcohol, and the blue dye was moving a lot slower because it was sticking to the chalk. My data for the blue Sharpie, the color was blue. It was only blue. There was no other components. It was just blue, and we could also find this in green Sharpies, and also probably any other Sharpie that has like a blue kind of color requires blue dye. So the observations for this particular Sharpie was that the ink did not separate at all into any different components, and it traveled up the chalk instead of being stuck at the bottom like how it was in the green, and it was a lot slower than the yellow. Here's my data for the red Sharpie. There was 2 components, the red and pink, which I found really interesting. I mean, obviously with pink being in it, it could be found in pink Sharpies. And the observations I made, the biggest one that stood out to me was that a little bit of pink separated out from the red. I thought this was really interesting. I didn't expect red to like break off into pink, but here we are. And the red dye was traveling up the chalk, but it was a lot slower than the blue dye from the blue Sharpie. So here's my data for the black Sharpie. It was 2 components, being dark brown and purple. This makes it seem like it can be found in other dark colors. So the ink separating into dark brown and purple, which means that black was made from more than just one color, which I did not think would happen. And the black barely moved on the chalk at all compared to all the other colors. And then my data for the purple Sharpie, it broke off into red and blue, and these can obviously be found in red and blue Sharpies. And it broke off into red and blue dyes, and the blue went up further on the chalk than the red did. They both went up, but the blue went further. So my conclusion was this experiment showed that most of the Sharpie colors, except for the blue, separated into multiple components. Black and purple Sharpie separated into 2 colors, which was surprising since I honestly thought that they would be a single color. I guess I should have seen that purple was not going to be a single color. I thought that from just it being a darker color, it was going to have like just one solid color, and like that being darker was going to keep all the components together. I was right about the green and red separating into different colors, but the red surprised me because there was a little bit of pink. I was not expecting the pink at all, actually. I don't know what I was expecting, but it definitely was not pink. And blue was the only color that did not separate. So, some errors was that there was an uneven amount of ink that was applied to the chalk, and another error could have been the rubbing alcohol getting contaminated. So an improvement that I have would be to use more of a controlled application of the ink, like instead of applying it just like randomly with different pressures, like using something like a ruler to keep it a consistent amount of ink would help each trial like start off with the same amount of ink and then give you more equalized results. So for the first question, my answer is that the colors that traveled up the fastest was the yellow from the green Sharpie and the blue dyes from the purple and blue Sharpies. The color that remained near the bottom was the blue dye from the green Sharpie, the red dye, and the dark brown from the black Sharpie. This tells us that dyes that move farther up have weaker interactions with the stationary phase and are more soluble in alcohol. And for question 2, I said if hexane were used, the polar dyes would likely move less because they don't dissolve well in nonpolar solvents, and in turn, this would mean that the nonpolar dyes would be more easily moved with the hexane.